Welcome to the Slingshot. This week's special guest is Sandeep Vaheesan, Legal Director at Open Markets. Sandeep is a thought leader on non-compete agreements and has been advocating the use of FTC rulemaking to address this and other forms of anti-competitive conduct. Sandeep, this is to make him blush, is a prolific writer. It seems that every week he's posting a new publication on Twitter. Some of us are a little jealous. In 2024 alone, while the rest of us have been slacking off, Sandeep has published pieces in Democracy, On Labor, The New Republic, The American Prospect, and The Nation. The only place he hasn't published in 2024 is The Sling, but I hear that's coming soon.
Absolutely.
He has a forthcoming book titled Democracy and Power, A History of Electrification in the United States, on the history and future of cooperative and public power in the United States. It will be published by University of Chicago Press in December of 2024. We can't wait for it to come out. Welcome, Sandeep. How's everything?
Great. Thanks so much for having me and for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Darren today.
Fantastic. And welcome, Darren, my partner in crime and co-host, who's good for at least one esoteric literary or film allusion per episode. It's like that prize, at the bottom of a Cracker Jack box. I don't know if you guys are too young to remember this, but anyway.
I remember those.
Hello, everybody. I am a Cracker Jack antitrust professor for sure. So.
Nice. In case you checked out of antitrust land, last week the FTC imposed a sweeping rule that bans all existing non-competes for nearly all employees except senior executives. But even for those, it prevents new non-competes. Now, the FTC also sued to block a fashion merger last week between Tapestry and Capri. So it was a big week over there. Today, we're going to discuss both of those topics, as well as a new paper from Sandeep titled A Revival of Nondomination in Antitrust Law, forthcoming in George Washington Law Review, which relates to the FTC's non-compete rule and offers one theory as to its broader significance. Hopefully, Sandeep can explain how. But let's start with the FTC's non-compete rule. Sandeep, I've been reading the Twitter. I'm sure you've been reading the Twitter and the reactions. The old antitrust gatekeepers. And I'm going to say that with the exception of some libertarian diehards, there was a great analogy to a wedding contract, but we're going to leave that aside. The opponents of the blanket ban on non-competes have almost ceded the arguments on the merits. There's really no doubt as to the harmful effects of non-competes on workers and on competition writ large. So it seems like the old guard is instead retreating to two other arguments. I wanted to get you to weigh in on those. The first is that these cases should be adjudicated under the Sherman Act on a case-by-case basis. The second is that the FTC lacks rulemaking authority. So let's deal with those separately. So Sandeep, why not pursue these non-compete cases one at a time in a federal district court pursuant to the rule of reason, ideally with a very charming economic expert? And also, would your answer change if the standard of case-by-case review were per se, as opposed to rule of reason?
Yeah, so I've seen this unfortunate line on Twitter, and the reality is under state common law, we had something like the rule of reason for centuries. Judges evaluate the reasonableness of non-competes on a case-by-case basis, weigh the adverse effects on the worker, benefits the employer, effects on the general public, and makes a decision based on that totality of the circumstances test. And this experience shows that, if employers are given even an inch to use these contracts, they will use them indiscriminately, quite correctly recognizing that very few of these non-competes are ever tested in court. Employers use them not really with an eye toward enforcing them, maybe with respect to C-suite types and elite professionals, but otherwise they use them as a deterrent device. Include them in employment agreements to say, hey, think twice about looking for another job. Certainly think twice before leaving for a competitive position. So most of the action is happening outside the courts. And so anything short of a per se ban means that employers will continue to use them rather freely, recognizing that a minuscule fraction of these contracts ever make it into court under either common law or the federal antitrust laws. So I think that's a preliminary fact that many of the proponents of the rule of reason don't quite appreciate. Second, even if you get into court, I don't need to tell you and Darren this, under rule of reason standard, you're talking about extremely costly litigation, time-consuming litigation, and highly uncertain outcomes. So the assumption is, most workers will have the resources and the wherewithal to hire a lawyer and try to get one of these contracts invalidated, spending a lot of money up front with the hope of being free from the non-compete at the end of the day. My view is most lawyers are not going to take this case at the outset. They'll say, I don't see any money in this. I see a lot of expense, but what is the payoff at the end? So I think the rule of reason standard is unworkable. We've already seen how it operates. Workers will continue to be forced to sign these contracts and prevented from leaving their current job. So I think the proponents of the rule of reason standard really need to grapple with the history of these contracts before saying case-by-case adjudication is the solution. We've had that. It hasn't worked for workers. It's been basically licensed to employers to use these contracts as they see fit.
Yeah. Feel free to use the UFC case as an example. That was a 10-year saga, and the central controversy there was a non-compete, right? And so 10 years, I could say the number of thousands of hours that the Singer Group may have billed on that case. But
there are incidental benefits to the rule of reason. I'm not going to deny that.
Yeah, for experts, but who cares? We're not trying to maximize experts' welfare, right? We're trying to maximize something else. Let me turn to my second question, which is, can you quickly paraphrase the arguments of the Chamber of Commerce and that accounting firm with air quotes called Ryan? I'm still not convinced, who claim that the FTC lacks rulemaking authority, if not generally, then at least for writing a rule governing worker-employer relations. So what's their argument and what's your rejoinder?
So both Ryan and the Chamber have thrown the kitchen sink at this rule, and they've argued the FTC doesn't have rule writing authority. I've looked at the text, 6G of the FTC Act. It says to make rules and regulations for the purpose of carrying out the provisions of this subchapter being the FTC Act. That seems pretty clear and ambiguous to me. But they're telling the public and the judges that'll hear this case, ignore the text, look at the legislative history, look at the structure of the law. FTC doesn't have rule writing power. So that's one argument. The second is this is a quote unquote major question. Now, what's a major question? It seems to be in the eye of the beholder. And therefore, the FTC cannot regulate non-competes without clear authorization from Congress. They say there's no clear authorization. So those are two of the principal arguments, but then they're also making policy arguments, saying, non-competes have all these benefits, a per se rule is unwarranted. And that argument strikes me as coming from people who didn't actually read the rule carefully, didn't read the 500 plus pages of analysis that the FTC put out last week, summarizing all the literature, including the literature that's more sympathetic to non-compete clauses. So they're saying, don't look at what the FTC said, just trust this conventional law and econ view of non-competes. It's complicated, a per se rule isn't warranted. And then last but not least, this is more of a throwback argument. They're saying, well, this has been subject to state law forever. The feds shouldn't get involved. But, since the New Deal, Congress and federal agencies have had broad regulatory authority under the Commerce Clause. And this is very much commerce as the courts understand it today. So that's probably the weakest of the argument, but they, really covered the waterfront in going after this rule.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting that they were very eager to challenge the rule. It was voted on, but it's not published yet, right? So
it's published on the FTC's website. I don't think it's in the Federal Register yet. That might be a week or two away.
Right. So is it even considered final?
That's a good question. I don't know quite enough admin law to say whether it's truly final and ripe for a challenge. But the Chamber's been talking a big game since the FTC put out its proposal in January of 2023, saying, we're going to fight this rule. We'll be ready on day one. And I think a lot of it was a way of intimidating the FTC and really other agencies from not doing things the Chamber doesn't like. So they've been huffing and puffing for a year and a half. FTC said, no, this rule is based on evidence. We have the statutory authority to do it. Put out this great rule last Tuesday. And so that the chamber had to move.
That's fair. And doing things that the chamber doesn't like, that includes, anything.
Right.
So, but it's not a blanket rule, right? So there's actually a provision in there about acquisitions and exempting non-competes with respect to acquisitions of property and business, right?
That's right. So they carve out non-competes used in the sale or transfer of a business. And I think this is a pretty sensible and defensible exemption. So to make this a little bit more concrete, think of a dentist who's in her late 60s, early 70s, wants to retire, spend more time with her family and grandkids, wants to cash out. Young dentist is ready to buy the practice, but says, look, I understand that you want to retire, but I'm also a little bit concerned that you might not honor your word. And 6 months or a year after we make this deal, you'll just set up shop down the street and take all the patients that came to your practice for the last 30 years. Under those circumstances, I think a non-compete is a good way of protecting the goodwill in the business. You want to be able to facilitate those types of business transfers and transactions. And I've thought at length about this issue, and I think there's no contractual tool quite as good as a non-compete for protecting that goodwill that someone might pay hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars for. I don't think a non-solicitation contract does it. An NDA certainly doesn't do it. So this, I think, is the one instance where a non-compete is a sensible tool and that we should broadly allow businesses to use. So I think the FTC, to its credit, recognized this and carved it out.
Okay. So you talked about major questions before and the major questions doctrine. And I know that there's been lots of talk in the Twitter sphere and elsewhere about exceeding the agency's statutory authority in terms of rulemaking and in the scope of the rule tool too. And some of those arguments are basically if you use your power or extend your power too far, it'll actually create damage to the agency that's more long lasting. So, don't do this because major questions doctrine and it'll hurt the agency. Don't do that because it'll just make the agency lose face. So what do you think of these arguments of don't do anything or else and I'm asking a leading question, obviously, don't do anything or you'll get hurt.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing these arguments are raised in good faith because they invariably come from people who want the FTC and other administrative agencies to be doing little, if not nothing. They want the agency to keep its powder dry, but to what end? We don't want the FTC to keep its powder dry for the next 50 years. We want this authority to be used for good things like protecting workers from non-compete clauses. And yeah, I think everyone's aware of the legal risk to the FTC and other administrative agencies. The Supreme Court has made clear that it's not a fan of these institutions, particularly when they exercise their power to protect workers or consumers or the environment. Nobody is blind to the risk, but that doesn't mean the FTC should just sit on its hands and say, well, we're too scared. The courts might strike us down. The FTC needs to take its shots, recognizing, yeah, it's probably not going to bat 1,000 or even 700, but if it bats 200 or 300, it's delivering some real wins for the public.
Very nice. Well, let's move on to topic number 2, which is also was topical and in the news this week. Last week, the FTC, of course, challenged the Tapestry Capri merger. And I remember I like to start my day reading Deal Book, the little snippets. And I remember reading a quote from the chair of fashion at Gibson Dunn. And the first thing that I thought was, that is so cool that there's a chair of fashion. I didn't even know fashion would warrant a chair
Right.
at Gibson Dunn. But anyway, thought that was pretty cool. He told Deal Book that the fashion industry is contestable. Now I'm paraphrasing. What he said is there are so many brands that anyone can come up with a new style or label. Like you and I could do it, in our basement. And thus, can't be monopolized, almost like it's a special case, almost deserving like an exemption from antitrust rules. So what's wrong with this notion? Can't anyone make a handbag?
Yeah, so this is a market in which brands and product differentiation matter a lot. We're not just talking about functional products. If you just want to look at ways to carry your wallet and your cell phone and, a pack of chewing gum, you can just get a cheap gunny sack at Walmart and be like one of those characters in Looney Tunes and walk around the country with all your possessions on your shoulder. But that's clear. There's clearly more to these products than just functionality. People buy them to uh, show that they're current and fashionable and uh, maintain respect in the eyes of their friends and acquaintances. So brands matter a lot here. And the simple functionalist approach to this market ignores that. People carry a Coach purse or a Kate Spade purse because of the brand. There's functionality, but they're trying to impress. And that means that you might have a new entrant come on the scene and command the same respect that Michael Kors does. But that's not going to happen overnight. That'll take years, if not decades, to happen. In the meantime, Coach, Michael Kors have a status value that other brands lack. And I think the FTC. Yeah, so we're talking about status goods. People carry purses and other accessories, not just for the strict functionality, but because they convey something about themselves to their friends and acquaintances. They're people of means, they're people of taste. And yeah, in theory, someone can enter the market, start selling purely functional bags, but they're not going to be able to command the same cachet and status that comes with a Kate Spade or Coach or Michael Kors bag. These companies have spent years developing their brands, acquiring certain prestige in the eyes of consumers and the public, and that's not something that's easy to replicate.
Got it. Now, I thought that there was something very interesting in this complaint, and that the FTC once again cited the prospect of worker harms. And so we see
Right.
this now following on the heels of, I guess, the Kroger-Albertsons merger complaint, right, where they also alleged merger harms. Then, of course, the DOJ's entire challenge to the book publisher merger was built on worker harms, their author harms. The complaint
Right.
in paragraph 9 talks about this episode in July of 2021 in which Tapestry publicly commits to a $15 hour minimum wage for its U.S. hourly workers. And then a lot of this is redacted, but you see this back and forth between its rivals at Capri immediately taking notice, and then Michael Kors, VP of stores, wrote separately that he's going to have to increase the wages in response to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, is this the kind of evidence that you find compelling to make a case for worker harms? And relatedly, what do you think the relevant labor market would look like? Is it workers in affordable fashion industry? How would you define the contours of this labor market?
Yeah, I find evidence like this quite compelling because we are hearing from the executives themselves who they view as their competitors, whether it's in product markets or labor market. So in some ways, this is a way of circumventing the market definition issue. Just listen to how these managers talk about rivalry in the course of business, and it's clear, as you said, a lot of the relevant information is redacted, that the executives view these companies as not only competitors in the downstream market, but as competitors for workers. So someone who's currently employed at a Coach store might view a Michael Kors store as their next best alternative. If they're upset with their boss, they want to change jobs, they'll say, well, I'm going to apply at Michael Kors and try to get a sales position there. And the fact that the companies are sort of eyeing each other for minimum wages is very revealing. They're not looking to the broad retail market. They're not even looking to the narrower fashion market. They're looking at affordable luxury, both downstream with respect to customers, but also with respect to workers. And you can imagine workers acquiring relevant skills after spending 5 years at a Kate Spade store. They've built up a lot of knowledge about this segment of the fashion industry. Their next best employment option is a place where they can put that knowledge and experience to use. And I find a lot of mainstream antitrust takes on labor markets, especially service and retail labor markets to be somewhat elitist. They're dismissive of the knowledge and skills that workers in these markets have, and that often inclined to say, well, retail is retail. Someone working at Kate Spade can just go find a job at Walmart. There's nothing firm or industry specific about what they do, and I think that reflects a deep elitism as well as a basic lack of understanding about the day to day involved with these jobs.
We're turning it over to Darren, but hold on, Darren, I didn't get to comment on how fashionable Sandeep looked today. It's a really nice shirt. So, we have you on as our fashion expert. So you got to play the part. Sorry.
Yeah, I figured today was the day I should wear a button-down shirt since I'm being recorded on this podcast. And I'll let my wife know that you complimented this shirt. I think she got it from me.
I've been on this podcast with you for ages, Hal. What the heck? All right, so so speaking of fashion, I imagine it's fashionable to keep reading the Wall Street Journal opinion pieces. I think it's the 93rd now that about attacking Lena Khan as if she is the only voting member of the commission.
Right.
The title is Lena Khan Wears Prada. And of course, apart from the obvious analogy that Lena Khan is the devil in their opinion, and once you get past the stupidity of the headline, it starts out, it's hard not to chuckle at the FTC's lawsuit last week seeking to block luxury fashion firms Tapestry and Capri from merging in the name of protecting America's working class. Perhaps in Chair Lena Khan's elite circles, folks who shop at Jimmy Choo think of themselves as the proletariat. So I have to ask, why should antitrust care about fashion?
The Wall Street Journal is nothing if not predictable. As soon as the suit dropped, I was fairly certain they would publish a snarky, ignorant editorial like this one. But the reality is, there's no fashion industry exemption. The antitrust laws apply to all businesses. The FTC has jurisdiction over almost the entire economy. It includes fashion. The FTC pled an entirely plausible and credible relevant market here and concluded the market shares are going to be above the presumptions announced by the Supreme Court. We also see possible injuries to workers at these retail stores. The FTC cannot, after doing this careful investigation, say, well, this merger looks illegal, but fashion is not really that important. It's not food or healthcare or telecommunications. You know what? We're just going to let this one go. So Congress charged them with.
That's exactly the point that these folks are making. In essence, they're suggesting, in many times, that the FTC has a limited and scarce resource budget, and they have prosecutorial discretion in a sense. And so, why are we focusing on saving better people who are better off when you could be looking at this other industry, which, by the way, we don't want you looking at either, but we're going to at least say that.
Yeah, to the first point, by all accounts, the market shares here are quite high. Well above the structural presumption. As Hal mentioned, some of the material in the complaint is redacted, so we don't know the full extent of how high the concentration numbers are, but my read is the concentration numbers are very high. So this is not one of those borderline cases. And second, the FTC found credible worker harm here. So this is not just about consumers. This is also about workers who are making $15 or $20 an hour. So we're not talking about elite workers. We're talking about people who live paycheck to paycheck. And it's important that the FTC protect those workers from concentrated market power. And second, I think you're right. The Wall Street Journal is never going to see a merger challenge that they like. So maybe this one is easy for them to ridicule, but they were skeptical of the Kroger Albertsons challenge as well. So they'll have a different line to disparage the FTC taking its congressionally mandated authority seriously. And, last but not least, I don't know much about fashion, but I do know that Chanel and Louis Vuitton are in a much different segment than Michael Kors and Coach. And in a sense, what the FTC is doing here is saying, we want regular people to be able to afford nice things too. You shouldn't have to be a big law lawyer to be able to afford a an attractive purse. And the FTC, Wall Street Journal's response is, no, too bad. Ordinary people shouldn't have nice things. The FTC should let this one go. So the Wall Street Journal's, faux populism doesn't really work here, because even those of us who are ignorant of fashion know that these are actually not high-end brands.
Yeah.
A great
And in
point.
fact, and the Wall Street Journal kind of suggests that you mentioned that there's the market concentration numbers are pretty high here, but the Wall Street Journal says that's because, and I'm going to quote them: the accessible luxury and affordable handbag markets are quote trick. So, so what is the trick to these markets, Sandeep?
So I'll say at the outset, market definition is fact intensive. It's hard to say at the outset, well, this is the relevant market, not that. So the Wall Street Journal editorial writer should practice a little bit of humility and recognize that the FTC staff have spent months looking at this merger, figuring out what are the product market boundaries here. And by all accounts, the companies here view affordable luxury as the relevant market. So it's not the FTC, gerrymandering a market definition into existence. The FTC looked at what the companies themselves were saying, who they were identifying as their competitors, before concluding, okay, actually, affordable luxury is a relevant market. That's how the companies view the landscape. And we'll learn more over the course of this trial. The complaint was heavily redacted, but what's interesting is that Wall Street Journal actually ran a story, I think a year or 18 months ago, talking about the affordable luxury market. So, but before publishing these snarky editorials, some of the people at the op-ed page should probably talk with the journalists actually studying markets at their same newspaper.
Yeah, John Newman pointed that out.
Yeah.
Quote tweet of my tweet, which, by the way, not like anyone's counting, but it's doing pretty well. If you guys are listening, you might want to go check out that thread. But I had a little fun with the Wall Street Journal.
Numbers are important.
They are.
We mentioned contestable market theory. I want to ask you guys about. Do you remember in Baumel's famous paper? I think it was in '84. What a famous industry he suggested was contestable?
Was it airlines?
Yes.
Oh God! I told you, Sandeep, Darren is good for one esoteric allusion per episode. Just pulls these out of thin air, but it's good stuff.
I think he and I probably think about that example with disturbing regularity, because it shows how absurd some of these theories are. We've had 40 years of airline deregulation.
The airline industry. If we wanted to drop our day job, we could pull that off. You don't think?
Yeah, no, American Airlines dominates Dallas-Fort Worth. They must be making a lot of money. Why don't the three of us raise some money, get a startup airline going, and compete against American? What's stopping us?
That's the spirit.
Yes, our love of the sling, maybe. But I wanted to read you this one line, and then we'll go on to your article, I promise. But this comes right out. This is verbatim. Quote, "The agency is redefining antitrust law to include employment when its legal justification, as interpreted by the courts, is consumer benefit," end quote. That thing floored me. It even offended Herb Hovenkamp, who, upon seeing my thread,
that's how bad it is.
He said, unlike Section 3 of the Clayton Act, Section 7 covers sellers and buyers alike, and that includes labor. So he thought he was also disparaging of the Wall Street Journal's take. But there is they do express a viewpoint, and that viewpoint may have predominated not too long ago, right? It sounds kind of funny or laughable to us today, but wasn't that the traditional view, maybe of the '90s and the aughts? And I guess where I'm going is, how is the consumer welfare standard, which clearly put consumers at the top of the antitrust hierarchy, above workers, right, and everyone else, has it run its course?
I hope so. I think it's too early to say, but this is an area where there's a little bit of a gap, or there was a little bit of a gap between the courts and the agencies. The courts, since the early years of the antitrust laws through the present, have said, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, or at least most of the Clayton Act, applies to not just sellers but to buyers. You can find Brett Kavanaugh saying this. You don't need to go back to William O. Douglas or Louis Brandeis. You can point to contemporary conservatives for this point. So if you look at the case law, there's no doubt powerful buyers are covered. The DOJ and the FTC, however, basically ignored upstream power. The overwhelming majority of their cases involved harms to either intermediate or end use consumers. And so the DOJ and FTC were effectively saying we either don't think buyer power is a problem, or maybe more charitably, we don't have the resources to bring cases against power buyers. And what's changed under this administration, I think maybe the single most notable change under this administration, antitrust, is they've taken buyer power and employer power seriously. We've talked about the non-compete rule. We mentioned the three big merger challenges, one involving books, and then the two more recent ones involving grocery stores and fashion, where they've included employer power theories. And then third, the DOJ has made prosecution of no poach agreements among employers a high priority. So the DOJ and FTC are actually taking this sort of latent case law and putting it to good use and saying, no, we're responsible for protecting workers and other sellers, not just consumers. And yeah, the Wall Street Journal is horribly ignorant here. They need to start reading, Brett Kavanaugh 2021 before making these confident pronouncements about who the law protects.
Well, let's not read Brett. But
in general, I agree. But on antitrust, he's been better than expected, and he's said things that the three of us would agree with.
Well, no, I don't agree with that, because he's certainly tried to weasel in an efficiency defense, and I don't think that the Supreme Court has suggested one. And
no, I agree. Yeah, he was really bad on the DC Circuit, but he's been better on the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I know the case you're talking about. Yeah, the insurance merger.
Yeah. So the other thing I was going to point out really quickly is, like, if you go back and look for consumer welfare in the case law, the first case is from the Food and Drug Administration. So if we're thinking what consumer welfare means to the court, I'm not sure we're quite convinced it's the same.
Right.
But then when you start getting to the contemporary cases, where, in the 70s, the first mentions of consumer welfare cite Bork and the merger guidelines.
Right.
So it's not like it's coming from the Supreme Court. It's more like the lower courts trying to push this concept up to the Supreme Court. It's so not sure that, using that as the poll star we could go on for hours, and I'm not going to, but it's
no, this is a rich
not
topic.
necessarily something that stemmed from the Supreme Court.
Well, let's turn to Sandeep's new article. It's called "A Revival of Nondomination in Antitrust Law." So, Sandeep, the first thing you have to do is define for us what non-domination is, and how does your article relate to the FTC's non-compete rule, and how does it offer a theory as to its broader significance?
Sure. So in the article, I use non-domination and coercion somewhat interchangeably, but the basic idea is when one party dominates another, they can tell them how to do things at will with impunity. And in writing this article, I actually had to venture well out of my comfort zone and read some political theory, which wasn't always the most easy or satisfying topic to read, but I ended up learning a lot. And non-domination is a long-standing principle in political theory. It dates back to small R republicanism from ancient Rome. That's been an important theme in American politics since the founding of this country. And if you look at antitrust law, it was actually a major norm in antitrust doctrine through the late 1970s. The courts often talked about this idea of dealer freedom or freedom of the trader, meaning, if you're an independent worker or independent business proprietor, you had the right to exercise effective independence. Someone else couldn't tell you, as the owner of a small goods store, the price at which you sold tennis rackets or the line of goods you carried. So the court took this idea that if you were formally independent, you had the right to exercise real independence. And antitrust doctrine advanced this idea by prohibiting practices like resale price maintenance, restricting practices like exclusive dealing. But then starting in the 1970s, late 1970s, in decisions like GT Sylvania, the court said, that non-domination, freedom of trader stuff, that's all a relic of the common law. We don't care about that anymore. What we really care about is distributional efficiency and consumer welfare. And that was wrong as a descriptive matter. This wasn't a relic of the common law. This was an important theme in the post-war case law. If you read decisions like Albrecht or Schwinn or Simpson versus Union Oil, the court is very concerned about protecting the autonomy of independent business people. And the Supreme Court in 1977 just erased this history. And Justice Byron White actually has a nice concurrence saying, this dealer freedom stuff is actually an important theme in our case law. It's the distributional efficiency stuff that seems to be made out of whole cloth. Like, I don't see it anywhere. So he called him out, but after White's concurrence, the theme largely disappeared, and even the liberals stopped bringing it up. And I see the non-compete rule as significant because the rule talks at length about how employers can coerce workers, really all workers except for senior executives, and says that we are banning non-compete clauses because employers coerce workers into signing them up front and then use them coercively to prevent them from leaving for greener employment pastures or starting a business on their own. And so this theme has been largely absent for the past 40 years, and the FTC rule could be a first major step toward reviving it in our competition policy.
I got to be honest. When I read your article, when I was early in the morning, I thought it said non-denomination, and given Justice Powell's reference discussion and in your article, I certainly could see how you would want to move from a non-denominational view of antitrust, but I misread it. I want to ask you about this notion of interbrand versus intrabrand competition. So in vertical restraints and this broader notion of free to contract is this notion of interbrand versus interbrand competition. And interbrand, I can never say that, is considered the best.
Right.
But if you think about merger enforcement and the notion that there are efficiencies and all these other things that people make up, then everything becomes more intrabrand, right? So, and if that's the case, interbrand competition becomes more important. And then, so if that's true, and I know this sounds like a slippery slope, but what do you make of the free riding theory informing decisions like Sylvania? And besides the embrace of a different economics, what else informed the overturning of the old case law on vertical restraints, like overturning of Dr. Miles?
Yeah, so I should say at the outset, those interested in Protestant theology shouldn't read my article. You're not going to find much value about that. But yeah, they are very similar words. So, to make this maybe a little bit more tangible, so interbrand competition is the idea that, the competition we care about is the rivalry between Honda and Toyota, different manufacturers of cars. Intra-brand is the competition that goes on between Honda dealer A and Honda dealer B, both trying to sell Accords or Honda Odysseys or what have you. And the Supreme Court has this interesting footnote in Sylvania, no citations, not even a Chicago School Law Review article, just saying, well, interbrand competition is what we care about, intrabrand is less important. And they adopt this theory that, vertical restraints like exclusive territories and ultimately resale price maintenance can foster greater interbrand rivalry. Basically, with vertical restraints, each dealer will have more incentive to promote, let's say, Honda. They'll have more incentive to provide, specialized sales support. Cars are a somewhat unusual example because we do care about sales support in cars. We do go to dealerships to learn about different makes and models. But the idea is, you want to prevent discounters from free riding on the services provided by higher end retailers. And they took this theory and really ran with it and said, free riding is a serious problem, implicitly assumed that it's common across the economy, and said, we need to broadly liberalize antitrust treatment of vertical restraints to address this menace of free riding. They didn't really grapple with the question of, how common is free riding? Do most goods actually require this type of sales support? I think the 30 seconds reflection would say no. High-end electronics and cars are really the exception. Most products are more akin to, toothpaste or laundry detergent than to a car.
They also didn't consider the availability of less restrictive alternatives. Can manufacturers do a lot of this marketing on their own? Can they pay retailers to do specialized product demonstrations and things like that? But starting in Sylvania in 1977, they said free riding is what we care about. Vertical restraints are one way of addressing it. And this was a theme in subsequent decisions like Monsanto in 1984, Business Electronics in 1988, and then kind of the case that culminated this vertical restraints revolution was Legion in 2007, where the Supreme Court overturned the, I guess at that point, 95-year-old per se rule against resale price maintenance and said, RPM can stop free riding. Therefore, we are overturning the per se rule. Going forward, we're going to evaluate resale price maintenance using the rule of reason. And by that point, the court had said, we're going to evaluate all vertical restraints using the rule of reason, at least when these restraints are challenged under the Sherman Act. And so the court really conducted a radical reconstruction of the law here, and most people in the public had no idea this happened. It's only antitrust nerds like us that noticed.
So in Legion, there in certain statutory interpretation texts, that there's a section that where Legion is put as changed circumstances.
Right.
If you look at Breyer, he talks about changed circumstances in his dissent. The notion is that what's changed is the economic literature, and it's changed to such a degree that that all of a sudden the benefits of RPM were discovered, and so Breyer takes issue with that. So when the court cites this may go back to my denomination point versus dominant, but when the court cites in its select literature and just kind of grabs that select literature to move the antitrust to the right, but Breyer says there's other literature out there, and this really doesn't necessarily mean that we should tilt away from per se. So why does Breyer lose?
So I think as a basic matter, Breyer lost because Republican presidents appointed more justices than Democratic presidents did. So I have a hard time believing that Legion could have come out any other way, given the number of justices that Nixon, Reagan, and Bush appointed between the three of them. But to your specific point on changed circumstances, I think Breyer's dissent is pretty good in explaining that the literature that the majority cites it's incomplete. Their lit review is not exhaustive. And then second, much of the literature is quite dated. They're citing these theoretical papers in the 60s and the 70s. There's not all that much empirical support for the free rider justification. It's just these very simplistic law and econ hypotheses that were promoted by people like Ward Bowman and Lester Telzer that got judicial validation and took on a life of their own. And I think Breyer does a pretty good job calling them out on that. But I think the place where Breyer really comes up short, and I came to appreciate this writing this article, was he didn't actually contest the fundamental revolution that Sylvania had initiated, whereby the court said, we no longer care about dealer freedom, we only care about distributional efficiency. And he takes that as valid. He doesn't call for revival of dealer freedom. He just says, okay, we're all in the world of distributional efficiency now. Let's just hash out the empirics. Does the free rider theory have empirical validation, or does it not? The majority says yes, it does, or at least enough to warrant rule of reason treatment, while Breyer says no, I don't think there's enough to overturn a 95-year-old precedent. Stare decisis should control. So in some ways, Breyer not only fought a losing battle, he fought a losing battle on the terms set by the Supreme Court starting in Sylvania.
Well, I think we might have to wrap it up there. I did want to have something show and tell. I got this at a fair in my neighborhood. Some of the moms put on a fashion show, and I picked up this little purse. I don't know, Sandeep, can you see this thing? But
I can see this. I think you should start competing head-to-head against Kate Spade and Michael Kors.
I think that this is
will fly off the shelves.
If I were the merging party's lawyer, I think this would be like Exhibit A. And I just whip this up in my basement, and it's proof that any of us can get into fashion, right? I feel ready to take on Michael Kors right now.
This novice fashion designer in Virginia, Hal Singer. Like he's scaring John Idle over at Michael Kors.
All right, and as soon as we get off this call, we should have another call to plot our invasion of the airline industry, because that too is contestable.
I think it's worth doing.
Are you free? Are you free?
Yeah, I think we can line up a $1 billion commercial loan to get this.
Oh, I got some
going.
friends. All right. Well, Sandeep, it was great to have you on. I hope you had as much fun as we did.
This was a lot of fun. I feel like we could have talked for another 2 hours.
I know. But we got to plot our next missions, our next industries that we're going to invade.
I'm starting right now. So.
All right. Well, have a good one, guys.
All right. Good chatting. Apologies for rambling a little bit.